Welcome to the Biz Coach Show. In every episode, we share information and advice for small business owners, small business leaders, startups, and entrepreneurs preparing to launch their business. Our mission is to give entrepreneurs the edge they need to succeed. If you're in need of business coaching, head over to mybizcoaches.co and book your free coaching consultation today. The Biz Coach Show is presented by Eric Whitmoyer, the owner of My Biz Coaches, a business coach, serial entrepreneur, author, and speaker, as well as David Macon, a certified professional in talent development, growth expert, writer, and small business strategist. Well, good afternoon, Eric. How are you doing today?
I'm doing excellent, David.
Awesome. Well, I'm really excited to talk about this topic we've got for today. And hey, if you have not been following us in this series, we're working through 8 topics, things to prepare for, kind of trends in 2024, which is based on Eric's newsletter series that he has. So if you haven't subscribed to those, there's the Entrepreneur's Edge and the Biz Coach Notes. Definitely sign up, check them out. And they're really good, helpful information. But right now we're halfway through this 8-week series, and we're talking about trends, things that Eric's anticipating will be an impact to small business in the upcoming year. So today we're actually going to be talking about remote work. And if you want to make sure you don't miss future episodes in the series, make sure you subscribe or head over to our Biz Coach Show playlist if you want to watch previous episodes. Definitely a lot of good stuff to check out there. So I think just to start things off, Eric, why did you pick, of all the things you could have picked, right, in your series of 8 things, why did you pick remote work as something to focus on in 2024 for small business?
Well, that's really easy, actually. I'm just going to blame COVID. But yeah, obviously there was some presence of remote work in the previous years, and I think that one of the things that's played out over that period of time, more and more companies have recognized it. There was a lot of emphasis on lean operations, and people are like, if we don't need all of these, solutions, services, whatever, right? And so we can be leaner, we can be tighter. More people opted to work and be remote. I don't need an office. I could just work from home because I travel or whatever. So we've seen it more and more, but COVID just kicked it into high gear, right? I mean, it just put it in a whole nother space. And I think that the reason this is really going to impact us going forward into 2024 is twofold. One, from the corporate perspective, from the company perspective, many companies during COVID and then shortly thereafter have begun to unload their leases. Yeah. They've had, they had these real big work environments, and because of COVID, they were forced to make decisions to buy equipment and solutions that would allow people to work remotely. Nobody really knew how long COVID was going to take, so everybody had to pivot and make these decisions. And they made some relatively sizable financial investments to be able to do that, right? Set people up to do the remote work and all that fun stuff. And in so doing, they also took a look at it and said, hey, we got this lease coming up. I was like, We don't know anybody's coming back to work. Let's just not renew the lease.
We bought all these computers and servers and absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. So, and you think about it, I mean, I don't know exactly what the average useful life of a computer is anymore these days, but I think at one time we were depreciating them out about 5 years. So, you make a commitment in 2020, 5 years later is 2025, and the lease was up in 2021. We're like, do we really need this lease?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
Needless to say, a lot of people opted out of those leases, chose to unload that real estate, and now they don't have somewhere to move people back into. So that's one. And then I think with the other piece of it that we've seen on the flip side of it, from the employee perspective, a lot of people are like, hey, I kind of like working remotely. This is, I'd prefer to do this. This is easier for me. Now, I definitely have my arguments as to whether or not that's valuable and to the same degree. But I specifically on one of our early shows, we talked about massive layoffs by the tech industry, and I pointed a finger directly at productivity reduction during COVID because of the remote work focus, and we weren't prepared. I say we, it was the companies as well as the employees were not prepared for that adjustment. You had an added component to it that's not fair to assess, but during COVID, you not only had everybody got pushed to work from home and may not have been prepared for that, right? But you also had the added disadvantage, which is a fair consideration, but you also had a lot of people that had children that were home, which is a whole added, that's a whole other dynamic that you you have to factor in. But when you removing that, I think it's a little bit more functional for people to work from home, assuming they have the right resources and things like that. But I know we're going to get into that a little bit more. But when you look at that and the number of people that are working from home that will prefer to work from home, we get the Great Resignation. People are like, you know what? If I can't work from home, I'm not going to work here. I quit.
Right. Yeah,
it's like
very true. Yeah.
So this is very much here to stay long term, right? How long? I mean, I don't think it's ever going to go away. I think it's going to become a component of the way we work going forward. So, but there's a lot of other things that we'll get into today that I think there are considerations that we really have to factor in. But a couple of statistics that I was going to share that are really relevant. They 83%. There's a study done. Let me find it here real quick. But 83% of the companies that were assessed, that were surveyed, said that they see this as the future of remote work, of the workforce place. Right? Is it 83% will be remote work? 83% believe that remote work is here to stay, and that will be a major focus for going forward. And then a secondary component, a secondary statistic was 65% of employees felt they're more productive working from home, working remotely.
Yeah.
I say home remotely, right? Because some people chose to work from other places or whatever. But now that is a statistic I probably would challenge, because I feel like you're more productive, but whether or not you're actually more productive is probably still up for debate. But just hearing those two statistics alone, people who are in the know of, this is what we're focused on, this is what we're planning to do, 83% saying this is what's going to happen. We need to plan for it.
Yeah.
And as it relates to our listeners being small business owners, if that's where corporate is going, the big companies, the big organizations employ tens of thousands of people, and that's what 65% of the people out there are saying that they prefer, then as a small business owner, you need to be able to adapt and or adopt some of these strategies, concepts, and perspectives to be someone who's somewhere somebody wants to work.
Yeah.
Right. Because if I can make $80,000 working remotely and I can work $80,000, but I have to come into your facility, that could be the difference, right? I could to choose, especially if it's really important to me to work remotely, that could make a big difference. There's also which, honestly, I hadn't really thought about it as deeply, but it literally came to me as we're thinking about it. If I can work remotely and live in Tennessee, I've had the advantage of living in Phoenix for the last 20 years. And cost of living relative to real estate and most other expenses is relatively small on a national scale for a large major city.
Yeah.
That's not the case anymore.
Right.
Our real estate prices rival some of the biggest cities in the nation now. And, you look at gas at $5 a gallon. We're a sprawling city where it's an hour and a half, probably from corner to corner of the city. In some place you could travel an hour and a half and go through, 9 different towns, right? So
right. Yeah.
But so it's that you consider those types of things. If I could make the same 120,000 in Phoenix in Tennessee, that's probably about 30% better lifestyle living. That's yet another consideration that, like I said, as we prepared for this, I hadn't really thought about it, but it hit me as we're talking. That's another thing that really would factor in for me if I had a job like that and I could work remotely and I could live in a place of, Whitefish, Montana. That sounds really appealing to me, at least for 4 or 5 months out of the year, anyway.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and I know I'm not going to say it's super low cost of living, but it's it's a completely different lifestyle for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and if I had a job that I could do remotely, that would be interesting.
Yeah, and I think what you talked about, maybe offering that as a perk, right, to be competitive with or even against, larger companies or competitors, I think is important. But also, you might be able to get higher level talent outside of your local area.
Absolutely.
If you have a remote opportunity. So that's something else to consider as well.
Yeah, totally. So
Awesome.
that's it. Yeah, I think that's a big piece. And I, as I said before, with the small business owner, they have to consider that they're going to play, they have to figure out how to compete against that.
Yeah. Well, and I think as we're talking about it, right, I think one of the things that is top of mind for both of us is just because that's the way things are headed doesn't mean it's going to be really easy to adapt. In fact, there's some really positive things about remote work, and then there's also some specific challenges. So can you kind of talk us through those?
Yeah, so certainly the positive things, well, let's talk about reducing. I mean, there's not many major cities in the United States that don't have a problem with traffic.
Yeah, right.
So if more people are working from home, you reduce the traffic. I mean, I can tell you, living in the city of Phoenix, and Phoenix isn't terrible compared to other major metropolitan areas,
Yeah.
but I kind of like the fact for about 2 years, I felt like I was the only person on the freeway. It was a better, probably more like a year, but it was kind of interesting to get on a freeway and driving in Phoenix after dealing with traffic for years in other cities like Washington or like
Oh,
Seattle
Seattle.
or
Yeah.
yeah, like LA, right? Just ridiculous amounts of traffic, and all of a sudden there's like no traffic. I'm like one of 8 cars on the freeway. I was just like, wow,
Right.
this is really crazy, right? But so that's a consideration, right? So not having to deal with going back and forth, well, and just thinking about that in itself, an hour a day in travel time
Yeah.
during rush hour traffic, right? Depending on
Right.
what your schedule looks like. I've never really had to deal with that much unless I had to catch a certain flight or something because I was always traveling and
Yeah.
or I made my schedule. I could determine when I'd leave the house. So I didn't have to deal with it as much for the better part of 20 plus years. But for those who do, I mean, you can add in LA an hour and a half each way, right? So
Right.
you're looking at three
Yeah. True.
hours right, of wasted dead time in a day. And you can do all you want. You can listen to audiobooks. You can, but it's still an hour and a half each way. That's 3 hours a day of dead time that's kind of lost. And if you're working 9 or 10 hours, that's more than half your day spent on the job. Whereas if I can do remotely, so there's some pros there for certain for the employee. A lot of other factors, right? I can be closer to home, things like that. I can usually I can work when I'm more productive. We didn't really talk about that, but you talk about the circadian rhythms. It's like when do I work best? Well, I work now these days. I work really good at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, and I work really good up until about 10:30, 11 o'clock. Then I need a break.
Yeah.
And but I can work when I'm good. And then I take a break and I'm good for a couple more hours. And I'm probably ready for another break, but I'm ready for a healthy break, maybe like 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
And then I can come back and I can do about an hour and a half or 2 hours of work, and then I hit the wall.
Yeah.
But I can kind of do it on my own pace. And that's another thing that a lot of people working from home like. From an
Yeah.
employer's
But
perspective, oh, go ahead.
I was saying the work you're doing is better quality work because it's in that zone for you, right? Where you have the
Exactly.
most creativity or focus or energy. So it's not hour per hour. You're actually, it's a multiplier in there that people don't think about.
Yeah, and yeah, it's exactly. So intensity would be the word that sticks out
Yeah.
to me. Like when I'm working on it, I'm doing whatever work I'm doing, I'm super focused on it for that period of time. And I don't have, as an employee, again, I'm not having all these distractions that I would
Yeah.
might have in an office. Now, the pros from the employer, right? Obviously, pretty obvious, right? There's a lot of cost savings for certain. I wonder. I think about that from that perspective from the employer. Other pros, I'm sure there's a number of things. It's better work productivity in certain regard, right? Again, I
Yeah.
still say that there's some caveats there because I do believe that they're on the con side of it. There are a lot of people who believe that they work better from home and don't, and I
Right.
think we proved that on multiple occasions. And we go back. It was last year around. It was probably about a month earlier from this time last year. But we did actually one of our first episodes we did on the mass layoffs from the tech industry.
Yeah.
And I mean, there were tens of thousands of jobs. I mean, 100 plus 100, a couple 100,000 of jobs that were layoffs, terminations that the tech industry was going through, and most of them all cited underperformance during COVID
Yeah.
because of the remote work and the inability to adapt, the unpreparedness to adapt, all that kind of stuff. So there's certainly something to be said from that perspective, and a lot of that was probably not being prepared. So since then, we've made some adaptations to that, and that's probably gotten better. But I still think it exists, right? I still think there's a certain percentage of people that are not prepared to work from home.
Yeah. No,
They're
totally. I
they're
was just
still. Go ahead.
oh, I said before you move on to the cons, I was just going to say as you were talking, from a business perspective, one of the things that I've seen, and you probably see this too, is as you're growing and scaling, eventually you run out of physical space for employees, right?
Sure,
And so then you have
absolutely.
to make difficult decisions about, increasing the footprint of your office or moving offices, which is a freaking nightmare, right? Or,
Yeah.
those sorts of things versus, hey, maybe we allow some employees to go remote, or, we split time, right? And you can start to get creative as you're scaling without having to, find a new location, increase your, your lease, right? Those sorts of things. So that can be a great strategy if it works for your business and your employee type.
Yeah. You know what? The other thing I would even say, David, it made me think of it as you were talking. There was the term flex time is
Mhm.
kind of an interesting perspective because that actually existed back in the 80s.
Yeah, yeah, true. You're right.
Yeah. Flex time was something that was created back in the 80s, and it was to suffice, I'm not going to say just to, but a category of worker that it helped was the single mothers or women with children who needed
Yeah,
the ability to, right? And so, I mean, so you go back, I mean, it's shoot 50 years now, right? At this point,
yeah,
45, 40 plus years. That was, and it's been around since then, but that's the kind of person that this, this remote work really kind of benefits because they can actually apply themselves when it makes sense. And if I need to work in into from after I put the baby down from 8 until midnight, it works for me, right?
yeah.
And so there's a lot of pros in that regard. And again, going back to your point, I'm not distracted, I'm not interrupted, and I can work pretty solid for like 4 hours, right? And get a lot of things done. So there's a lot to be said in that regard,
Yeah. So what about
allowing me
the
and
cons?
allowing me that work life balance that I want.
Yeah, for sure. No, I totally agree. So okay, so a lot of pros. What are a couple of the cons that we want to be aware of?
Well, and so yeah, as I kind of hinted towards, right, some of the first cons are one, there's just people that aren't prepared to work from home. Not only having you and I both have done this for years, very well as I do, without a designated space within the home
Yeah,
to be an office and a door with the lock and maybe some sound barriers as well. The reality is that working from home is not conducive for many people, if not
right.
most people. Even now today as an empty nester, I'm kind of like, it works really good until my grandchildren come over.
Right. Yeah.
And for some reason, they don't have the same boundaries that my kids did, right?
Yeah.
They don't accept the same boundaries, let me say. But so, there's certainly there's a certain group of people that just don't work well unmanaged, right? And it's not to say this, maybe it's just accountability. Maybe it's just a constant or not constant, but a regular reminder to stay on task and things like that. And, that's definitely something to consider. Resources is another big one. If the company provides you a computer, that's great. But, for me, I will tell you, depending on the kind of work that I'm doing, and as a business owner, I do a lot of different stuff that I don't always really want to have to do. But if I didn't have 3 monitors, I couldn't be as productive as I am doing
Sure.
some of the things that I do, and I'm not nearly as productive as I wish I could be. Right?
Right.
So I'm actually trying to figure out if I can get 6 monitors. Right? Um, but yeah, I mean, when they set people up for work at home, I know my brother was actually working for a company, and they had actually sent him a system, that a 2 monitor system that they sent him because he had to go in and out of different software applications. So the companies are considering those things, but you may not always have all the tools and resources working from home. So that's something to consider. And the I think one of the big things, wouldn't say the biggest thing, but the one big thing is, and it's really as it relates to the small business owner, and we're talking about bigger companies in many cases, but the small business owner, they don't have as much ability to do remote work.
Yeah.
And so for them to compete against the bigger companies, even if they could match the dollars, if somebody's like, well, I can work remotely here, and with you, I have to be, in the facility, and that causes me to have to drive 45 minutes to work every day. That, it's already working against me,
Right.
and you may not have the same upward potential because you're a smaller company. So there's a lot of factors that work against some small business owner. But the biggest thing is a lot of the small businesses are in categories of business that don't really lend itself to being remote capable,
Right.
right? And we're talking. So again, if I run through the math on this, there's 32 million businesses in the United States. Of those, at least 95% of them are less than $10 million in revenue a year. And those are definitely the small businesses. And like I said, there's a lot of people here listening that are would be happy with $10 million a year, but that is very much
Sure.
smaller, relatively speaking, right?
Yeah.
That said, those particular companies that means 95% of 32 million is like 28 million or something like that, 29 million. Those companies are many of those are service-based businesses, even retail-oriented type of businesses that don't have the ability to work remote, or at least it would make it challenging to work remote.
Sure.
So, when you think about it from that perspective, maybe there's a job within that company or two that you could do remotely, but not the entire workforce. So then it's like, well, who gets to work remote and who doesn't get to work remote?
Yeah.
And then how disconjointed is that for the organization?
Yeah.
Right. You got a dozen people and most of them work out in the field and they're doing whatever jobs that they do. Let's say, for instance, it's a HVAC company, right? And they got one office person who works from home because they don't actually need an actual physical office, right? The drivers all take their trucks home and that's fine and all well and good. But, the reality is that the only person who could probably work from home is the bookkeeper / operations person that runs the day-to-day stuff, right?
Yeah.
Everybody else. And now here's the problem. If they don't have a good solution, this kind of leads us into our last piece here, but it's kind of tease it up. But if they don't have a good solution to really kind of prepare for and have regular meetings for conversation, communication, things like that, that's a major con, right? How do I bring everybody together and have those good, solid conversations? How do we talk about strategic planning, right? Where do we coordinate all that because we don't have a facility to do it? Those all become big cons. So there's a number of different things in that regard when it comes to the downsides to remote work. But I think the biggest thing is productivity and how, how do you measure it? There's a lot of different factors that come into that.
Yeah, and if I was just going to add one quick thing there is a interpersonal psychological aspect to that as well. That generally, right, people that work remote, they report that they're happier, they have more flexibility, those sorts of things. But over time, you start to feel isolation, right? And I know you've got some thoughts on how you manage that, but I think that's an important consideration, and you need to be planful and mindful of that. Otherwise, over time, right, productivity might be great, and then all of a sudden, starts to slope off, right? So definitely something you want to be aware of.
Well, and I'm glad you said that because that is absolutely one of the factors. As a matter of fact, one of the things when I was doing the research was isolation. That's one of the big things that people doing remote work have begun to acknowledge is that the isolation is it's almost deafening. It's like, it's actually straining to be alone all the time, right? And so they were talking about incorporating ways to engage people. As a matter of fact, now they have, what was the title? Engagement officer, I think is what it's.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah. So, and their sole responsibility is to gather people together with almost like a mixer networking type of thing with all the remote workers of, and again, these are the bigger companies, but yeah, they're bringing people together and engaging them in different ways to kind of keep them, so they didn't feel isolated on an island.
Yeah, as you said, island. Literally, I mean, most of my career, I've managed teams of remote employees, right? And invariably, right, somebody will say to me that exact phrase that, "Hey, I'm starting to feel like I'm on an island out here." And if you're not aware of how to manage that or how to avoid that, right, you're going to run into a lot of challenges. So, as you said, it took me back to those many conversations I've had with people of that island mindset, and that can be really damaging.
Well, and the last thing I'll say to that is we don't know how much of an impact that is going to be because it's going to take a few more years before we really see the drawbacks, the detriments of that, and what that really looks like when it's all said and done.
Yeah, totally. Well, hey, you at the end of your article, you had a few recommendations of how to make remote work in a small business. So, do you want to walk us through those?
Yeah. So the number one thing by far and away is setting clear expectations. The biggest gripe that I hear from most of the smaller companies that I work with that do have or allow people to occasionally even work remotely is that I don't know what they're doing when they're not here. Of course, my argument would be you don't really know what they're doing when they are there either. But especially when you're, and it's funny because I've literally used this analogy 4 times in the last 2 days, but the small business owner is the epitome of the person at the circus actor that literally is spinning 12 different plates at the same time, right? That is the small business owner. They have so much going on all the time that they don't really know what anybody's doing in any given time, quite honestly. And they're just trusting that the people are doing the best that they can with what they have to work with and everything. But it's setting when you have somebody working remotely, it's just that added dynamic of I don't see them, so I don't know that they're doing what they should be doing. And it would be really easy, and it's funny because I have to bring this up. It'd be really easy for that same business owner to engage with the client. Let's say, for instance, you David, you're working from home, and I'm your boss, and I make you jump on a Zoom call with me, and it just happens to be when your son just got home from school. So let's say it's 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He just got home from school. We're about an hour time difference in time zone or whatever. So he just got home from school. And I'm watching him literally, like, while we're talking, he runs into the room. Hey, daddy, shaking your arm, all that kind of stuff. Right now, generally speaking, I know you're not that guy. You're not going to let that happen. Your son knows not to do that and everything. But let's just say that happens. As that small business owner, and this is literally probably having dozens of conversations with business owners, that they immediately make the assumption, see, I knew he wasn't doing anything. His son's distracting me. He's doing this, he's doing that, whatever. And immediately they make the assumption the person's not doing anything. However, I know you were up at 5:30, 6 o'clock this morning when you started, sure. And you were working 3 hours before I even showed up to the office.
Yeah.
Right. So, but in that window of time, I've lost sight of, that. And because I'm not seeing you in the moment, these are the issues we have. So going back to the first one is expectations. Yeah. Be clear with both for you and for the employee. What are the expectations?
Yeah. Right? Sorry, I was saying a quick note on that. I think one of the things is I talk to people that are maybe new to remote work or hybrid teams is they tend to focus on hours. Right? What hours, your office hours, how many hours you work, right? And there's a time and place for that. But I think what's more effective, especially for remote work, is work outcomes, work product, volume of work, because, you shared examples earlier about, working in times where your energy and focus are best. And so, yeah, my Microsoft Teams might be yellow at 11 o'clock, but that's because I got up early or I worked late, and that's where I work best. But so long as my quality of work, the work output, my overall performance are at or above the levels they were when I was in the office, or what you would expect, then what's the problem? It's different, right? It may not be how you work or how I work, but the work's getting done. So what is the problem, right? And I think that's a perspective shift that people need to have.
That is exactly what it comes down to, and that's why I said it's when I say expectations, it's not just what my expectations of you are in the role, but it's also my expectations for me.
Yeah.
To know that you're going to probably start your day. You're just going to wake up and start working at 5 o'clock.
Right.
Right. And so I'm going to know that when I'm showing up at 7:45, you've already been on the job for 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
Right. You're probably 2 cups of coffee in already at that point.
Yeah.
And you're knee deep into 2 different projects already, as I'm starting my day. Yeah. And so that's important for me as your supervisor to remember that, so that I'm not, and so I say, when I say expectations, it's not just your workload and what I still expect your reports to get done at a certain time, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, I have to remember that you're probably have different expectations. And so I need to be clear. Yeah, you're likely going to work a different cycle. And so I need to remember that for myself so that we don't get confused.
Or leverage it even, right? Well, great. If you're going to start 2 hours earlier, I should show up with, that report on my desk in my inbox, right? And I can now jump into the most meaningful work that I need to do because you've already done all the stuff to set me up, right?
Absolutely.
And that's just the perspective change that people need to have.
Yeah. Yeah. As a matter of fact, what's interesting, I'm going to share this as a side note, is for small business owners, I think it's a really good tool. I just got a new virtual assistant, and the virtual assistant's actually in the East Coast.
Oh yeah.
So, I'm an early riser, and I've been doing that for years now. And I told and she's like, well, I get up really early, and I'm like, actually, that's perfect, because I'm up at 5 o'clock. I'm typically up at between 4:30 and 5:30, and I'm up and in front of my computer usually by 5:15, 5:30 at the latest.
Yeah.
And, I would say 4 out of 5 days a week. That's pretty much a standard. So it's perfect, because just as you're kind of getting started as an early riser, you're about an hour ahead of me. So I get into my workflow and you're already sharing the stuff, you're already updating.
Yeah.
I'm like, perfect. This is how I want to get my day started, because my mojo gets running earlier, faster. And I feel like I'm making momentum faster as well.
Right.
But
Yeah.
so that's where a remote work really works handy.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
Use those time zones and things to your advantage for sure.
exactly. Yeah. So the first one was expectations. The next one is the tools. And I think this is where, particularly with small business owners, it's usually is an apprehension to make an investment into the different types of tools and resources. And I think I think it's a mistake. You've got to, particularly if you're going to allow people to work from home, especially if you're somebody who is, I'd kind of like to know what they're doing. If you have the right tools in place to manage the workload. So for instance, most of my law firms use a software program called Clio. And I can go into Clio and I can see what you've been working on. I can see the files that you've been working with. I can see the notes that you made on each of the files and the follow-ups, the calls that you might have made to certain clients or whatever the case may be. But I can actually see the work that you've been doing and look at it quickly. And then I can even message you within the software program that will attach itself to the file and stays with the file. There's a lot of tools like that are very comparable. Even if you need a more generic one, you could always look at HubSpot is something similar like that, right? So it's not just a CRM, it's actually a workflow tool that you can incorporate that actually uses things like calendar functions and things like that and incorporates it all into one tool. So small companies can afford that. There's usually, a reasonable amount of money per seat, in the application. And I think that's a phenomenal tool, because then everybody sees what's going on within the organization. And I think that's especially if you're going to have remote people, it's better for everybody to see what's going on at the same time. And as a supervisor now, I've got more insight into your workload and what you're doing and where you're at with certain projects or whatever, without having to wait for you to send me an email.
Yeah. Which might even give you more visibility than if they worked in the office, because now you've got more tracking and data, so there actually could be an upside there.
Yeah, and I think that now that comes with some training, right? You have to get used to doing it a little bit differently than you've done in the past. But even then, you could still have them push information to you. But then, if you want more specific details, you can actually go into the accounts and look yourself and see that. Particularly if you need to investigate or not investigate, but inspect some of that work that's been done.
Yeah.
So, but I think the tools are really important, and that includes things like Slack or some other kind of inter-office management tool, communication tool of some sort. Defining how to use those tools is another one. When you should use email, when you should use a phone call, when you should use text. Well, if you're starting at 5 a.m, I'm hoping you're not calling me at 5 a.m. if there's a problem.
Right. Yeah.
Especially if I'm not starting at 5 a.m. and vice versa, right? So having some understanding of how to leverage those tools, certainly we know which some of those tools are, and there's other tools that can be incorporated. But then what are the guidelines for those tools for everybody, not just for you and I as a supervisor and employee, for instance, but also for the other people that might be engaging with us. How are we, and these are good practices for any organization, regardless of remote work, but it's even more so with remote work because you have less ability to engage with people one-on-one when necessary sometimes.
Totally. Yep.
The third one is specifically communication. And I think that really starts with setting clear expectations. That's super important. But then in addition to that, it's, having regularly scheduled check-ins is really important. I think with remote work, you can certainly attest to that. You've done more than your fair share of managing remote workers, right? As a matter of fact, you could probably offer some insights here as well. But regular check-ins is a big one. I think another big one is, even though you may not have a designated workspace, depending on how remote you are, how many people on your team, but having regular gatherings, even in-person regular gatherings, just go to a restaurant and meet somewhere, not necessarily after hours, because you don't want to really extend people's work hours, but having some kind of like a lunch meeting or something like that as we referenced the whole island thing, right? Yeah. Bring people together occasionally. Once a month's probably not a bad focus. At minimum once a quarter, just to bring people together, have them have that human interaction, particularly if it's more remote and less hybrid. If it's hybrid, you can just coordinate it when you have people together. If it's truly remote, then you really have to go out of your way to make sure you bring some gatherings together to give that engagement level. So as you talk about communication, factoring in the physical interactions. Because now the next thing you have to consider when you talk about communication is also coaching sessions, right? So I'm not coaching you via email, text, or phone calls. If I have to, and I have to have, let's say, a tough conversation, at minimum, it's got to be a Zoom call.
Right.
And ideally, I'm still old school, and maybe I'm a little old school in that regard, but I'd still want to have a face-to-face to have that conversation. But at minimum, it's got to be a Zoom call, right? Video interaction. But to have that coaching session, hey, David, your reports just haven't been getting in on time, or the lack of work, you haven't done enough research, or whatever that is, right? So there's some factors there. And I think that's a big piece of communication, is thinking through what that looks like. I think when you make a plan for communication happens better.
Yeah, agreed.
It's when you don't have a plan and you pull it out of your butt is when it really gets out of hand.
Yeah, and I think you totally hit the nail on the head. And I think if I was going to add just one thing, it would be you need to be twice as intentional about communication as you do in a face-to-face environment, right? So you may, you normally might only have a one-on-one with your direct report, but you see them 5 times a week. You bump into them in the office, or you're eating lunch or whatever, right? But when you're remote, that single touch point is not nearly enough. And so having, like video, like asynchronous video communication, things like that, you just have to be way more intentional. Or, checking in with them via text about, hey, how about your sports team over the weekend? Or I remember you said your kid had an appointment today. How did it go? Right?
Yeah.
Those little things go a long way. You just have to be intentional about. You can't, walk into those things like you can in an office. You have to really take good notes, follow up, schedule follow-ups. I'll schedule text messages, right? Of, at 3 p.m. on this day, check in with them, and those things go a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny as you're saying that and being intentional about your communication and setting time aside to follow up on things like, hey, by the way, your son, I knew you had to take him to the doctor. How'd everything go? Right. I know your husband had something going on, whatever. Right. That people would say, well, geez, I don't have time for that kind of stuff. And I'm like, you don't have time. You don't not have time to do that. Right? There isn't enough time not to do that, because when you lose that good employee because they don't feel valued, right? That's it. But and how much time do you save by not having to drive back and forth to work every day?
Right. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Well said.
So communication is a big one. And then the fourth one is training, which kind of goes without saying as we're talking about these other components, but taking the time to make sure that people understand what the expectations are. This is literally this training in my eyes. So as we're talking about, the way I'm referring to it this is delegation 101.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I can give you something to do, and I can actually show you how to do it, and I can walk you through it and watch you do it, and then critique you for it, and then have you do it again, and then you show me how to do it. Right. And it's like, we can go through the process the way we should, or I can just hand you a bunch of crap and say, go do this.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And without the training, and then be pissed off because I'm unhappy with the workload. Right. So what was done with it. So you definitely have to go the extra step to get it, do the training. And then the last one is just having, and this, I think this is kind of what you were talking about, is having I call it a feedback loop, having a designed feedback loop, right? Feedback, feed forward. That I always led in a way that I constantly asked for feedback from my team. I still made my own decisions, so don't get distracted, right? Don't get lost in it. But I definitely valued the feedback from my team, and I wanted to get a sense of, or a feel for, what's going on. So having a feedback loop for everybody within the organization, how is this working? Where do we see challenges? And so making sure that there's an open communication with everybody in the organization about these remote work positions. What are your consternations? What seems to be challenging for you? And uncovering that with all the different departments, all the people associated with everybody in the group. Not just either the remote workers or the people not remote working, and the worst thing you can possibly do, and which, by the way, I've seen this happen regularly. You have people that work remotely, or even just hybrid, occasionally work remote. And then you have the people that are in the office, and there is a tendency, and the people that work in the office get the kudos because they're showing up.
Yeah.
And the remote people who are asking for and requesting this, it's almost like a nuisance. Yeah. They're like, oh, they're working from home today. It's like, I'm like, man, you are just setting yourself up for failure in every possible way by, by responding like that. And so I can see how I could, even myself personally, I could see how I would fall into that trap from time to time, particularly when there's things going
Yeah.
on and I'm frustrated because I feel like if they were just here, we could fix it. But
Yeah.
at the same time, you're immediately opening up a can of worms that's just you're never going to get the lid back on.
Yeah. Well, and that's the remote inequality aspect of it, right? And I'll just share an example of that. There's a company that I had worked for remotely, and they had everybody else at their headquarters, right, corporate office. And routinely, I would get on a call and assume that we were going to be talking about something or, make some headway. And it'd be, oh, hey, thanks for jumping on. We're actually not going to be talking about that today. We had a meeting on it and decided to do this. I'm like, what do you mean we had a meeting on it? I wasn't involved in the meeting. Well, we were all here and we were talking about it. So we just kind of decided over lunch about it. And I'm like, well, I wasn't part of the decision, right? And so you have to think about those things because people don't get equal face time in a remote or hybrid situation. And you do that once, okay. But if that's your routine operating process and you make decisions that way, hey, you're missing out on important information from key team members, but also you're letting those people feel marginalized. Like you don't really matter.
Yeah.
You're a remote employee, right? So when you said that, it brought me back to those painful memories, Eric. Thank you.
I can totally see that. And,
Yeah.
and you're absolutely right. I mean, that, and to your point, when you have a group of people that are in a concentrated area, and then there's another portion, however big that portion is, that isn't, they're kind of left out, even by default, not by design, but by default, right? Yeah. And so, that's going to happen. Those scenarios are going to play themselves out. And so as a good leader, I'll put that caveat on there with a big freaking asterisk because I know what you're talking about. Is that, hey, by the way, if you really want to make the best decision, you should probably consider making sure that everybody's involved in those decisions. Yeah. So, but
for sure. Cool.
Anyway.
Well, any other tips you want to share on remote work, Eric?
I think we beat it up pretty good, but I think the key here is that as you go into 2024 and beyond, for that matter, the reality is it's here. It's not going anywhere. You've got to, if you're a smaller organization and you're going to have to compete against it, you're going to have people that are going to pitch you against it. They're going to be, hey, I want to work for you. I think that you hit a really good nerve, which I had not thought about. Ironically, I'll even go one step further. You had mentioned you could open the quality of people that you might be able to open a job to because you would be willing, right? And there's a lot of people that are really putting that as an important component for them in their lives currently, right? So I can work remotely. That's important to me. Well, that person that wants to work remotely, maybe a huge outdoorist, right? And they don't mind working starting day at 5 a.m. so they can go home at 2 p.m. so they can do an afternoon hike before the sun sets or whatever, because they live in Whitefish, Montana or where, right? And this is somebody that somewhere else might get $150,000 a year, but they're content with $80,000 or $90,000 because that's good for them, where they get to live on the way that they want to live on their terms. And you can actually get some quality talent. You just need to be a little bit more open about how that plays itself out. And the piece that I'm going to add to that, even beyond that, international.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mentioned, we as we were prepping for the call just earlier, there's a whole contingency on an international level. There are really some, more that I'm getting out there. There's some really smart people in Australia, in Costa Rica, in other countries. English may not necessarily be their first language, but they're very competent and capable, very articulate in the way they communicate, and they're all over Europe. Even Africa, there's some really things that are developing in other countries now, and these people are putting a precedence on priority. That's probably the word, a better word, but they're putting a priority on the education. Like for instance, digital marketing.
Yeah,
there are tons and tons of countries. What we would have referred to 10 years ago as third world countries, those people are putting a ton of effort into understanding digital technology. Technology as a whole, digital marketing is a big one, because it doesn't take a lot to learn those skill sets It takes a lot to get good at it. It doesn't take a lot to learn the basic skill sets, but they can get in and learn the basic skill sets, offer their services. And now you're not talking about like a virtual assistant. You're actually talking about somebody who can actually, run a marketing agency or marketing or a team within your organization at a significant savings with the type of caliber of employee you could have because they live somewhere else in the world for that matter.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So things are changing. That's an important component to really kind of embrace.
Yeah. No, I love it. Yeah, really good stuff. Great perspective. And I do agree. I mean, we see this. I mean, in people we talk with every single day, we've lived it. We've lived remote work, right, over the years.
Yep.
So definitely something that we're very aware of. So I appreciate the perspective on it. And it's not going away, to your point. I think that's maybe the headline, or if you're going to highlight something, it's here. It's not going anywhere. You're going to have to figure it out one way or the other. So appreciate the insight. Anything you want to share about My Biz Coaches before we wrap up today?
So I'm gonna tip my hat. We have something big coming.
Awesome.
I'm gonna tell everybody here that you want to save the date, December 8th, Friday, December 8th. Haven't locked in the time yet, but we have a significant offering. It will be a free offering for anybody who would like to attend. But we're going to do a strategic planning and workshop for 2024. Using the 8 topics that I'm writing on over the next couple of weeks, the last 4 and then the next 4 weeks, we'll actually have once I finish each of the articles, then we'll go through, it'll be actually a white paper. I'll call it a white paper. I don't know exactly the best term for it, but it'll be an aggregation of those 8 topics put together in a format where we're going to use it as a tool to create your action plan for 2024. We'll be incorporating a lot of the topics or the tactics from my book, Success with Goals. And we're adopting it for the business owner and for strategic plans for 2024. And then we're going to actually incorporate some time management tips and prioritization to help people ensure that they hit their goals in 2024. So excited about that. That's coming December 8th. Is the date, Friday, December 8th, and we'll lock in the time. It'll be announced. We'll be doing it live on LinkedIn. So yeah, pretty excited about that. So it's a big piece. The official announcements will be going out likely next week. And then we're also going to have the secondary announcement then we're going to have some aggressive promotions starting Black Friday and running through the holiday weekend.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, we haven't talked a ton about your book on the show, Eric. So I just wanted to let people know if they want to pick up a copy. Yep, you can just scan the QR code. Available ebook and print. I've got at least 1 copy. I might even have a couple. I think you signed 1 or 2 of them. So yeah, it's a great book. And heading into the new year, definitely you want to read it now. So go get your copy now, because then you're ready for the new year and you can start doing the prep work that Eric outlines. And then if your business is considering, hybrid, remote, maybe it's for you, maybe it's not, you're not sure, you just want to talk to a coach that specializes in that, be sure to book your free consultation. Great time to ask questions. And then even beyond that, right, talk about other opportunities and areas within your business. And Eric's got a whole process and his coaches use to uncover, those opportunities. So definitely do that as well. But Eric, it's been great. Thanks for the information and insights. And go subscribe to his newsletter if you haven't already, so you don't miss the next article and the next conversation. So thanks, Eric.
Awesome. Thanks, David. Appreciate it.
All right. See you in the next episode.